Look, I mean, I've watched this. I watched the whole rise of wokeism, its effect on comedy, and the fall of it. And essentially what happened was just that the market spoke. Guys like the best example I thought ever was when Shane Gillis got invited back to host, and he's done it a couple times now, Saturday Night Live.
Yeah.
I mean, literally, the guy got fired as a cast member and then got brought in to host the whole show. And you know why? Because he was selling out stadiums all over the country.
Yeah.
And like at a certain point, the
actually
Netflix
true.
and Saturday Night Live, they look at it and they go, well, we need the people. I mean, that's our business model. And because of, and we could get like a whole book could be written on this, but by the very fundamental nature of what wokeism is, it cannot be funny.
That clip right there, that's the whole story. 20 years of watching the best comedy network in America turn into a graveyard. Chappelle Show, South Park, Tough Crowd with Colin Quinn. The Daily Show, before it became a lecture series, that was Comedy Central. That was the gold standard. And then wokeism walked in and just gutted it. Not slowly, fast. Overnight, it felt like Dave Smith has been doing stand-up for 2 decades. He lived through it. He watched it happen from the inside. And what he just said is something the mainstream media will never say out loud because they were cheerleading the whole collapse. Comedy didn't die by accident. It got strangled. And the people who strangled it are now pretending they had nothing to do with it. Stay with us because what comes next is the receipts.
Yeah, I mean, it's been, it's very interesting for me because as you know, Piers, I'm kind of like a hybrid or what, like I'm kind of in both the political and the I'm a touring stand-up comedian. But when I come on your show, I'm not really coming on as a comedian. I'm also obsessed with politics and I like talking about this stuff. Look, I mean, I've watched this. I watched the whole rise of wokeism, its effect on comedy, and the fall of it. And essentially what happened was just that the market spoke. Guys like the best example I thought ever was when Shane Gillis got invited back to host, and he's done it a couple times now, Saturday Night Live.
Yeah.
I mean, literally, the guy got fired as a cast member and then got brought in to host the whole show. And you know why? Because he was selling out stadiums all over the country. And like at a certain point, the Netflix and Saturday Night Live, they look at it and they go, well, we need the people. I mean, that's our business model. And because of, and we could get like a whole book could be written on this, but by the very fundamental nature of what wokeism is, it cannot be funny. It's impossible to be woke.
I totally agree.
And so in the comedy world, when wokeism came in, everything became a lecture. Everything became about like making this point. And that's just the enemy of funny. And so you watched it. Comedy Central was like, dude, when I started comedy, so I've been doing stand-up for 20 years. When I started, Comedy Central, the comedy network in America, had the Chappelle Show, South Park, Tough Crowd with Colin Quinn, The Daily Show, and The Colbert Report. It was like some of the greatest comedy shows that have ever been made. And in the era of wokeism, they just produced like nothing. And so essentially, I think you're right, Piers. Wokeism still exists. The tides have turned, and it's now a super majority issue to oppose it because it's stupid, and it always has been.
Well, what I thought watching the Netflix special was that I used to watch a lot of those roasts. I remember them, and they were always completely outrageous, and they always involved incredibly shocking and outrageous jokes and deeply offensive. That was the whole point of being roasted. The roastee would be absolutely torn to pieces in the most shocking, personal, and offensive manner imaginable. And I remember there was a famous northern comic in the UK called Bernard Manning, who was deemed too outrageous after the 80s to appear on television. But he used to sell out all his shows. And I went to see him in a working men's club, and he was completely hilarious, but shocking and outrageous, and would have fitted in very nicely to the roast kind of format. But when I interviewed him, I said to him, he told jokes about everything, right? And they were all offensive and would have got him cancelled left, right and centre if he'd done it in the last few years. But what he said was, I took a view, he said, early on in my comedy career, that I wasn't going to make an exception for anybody. Because the moment you make an exception, the moment you give one section of society a comedic pass from being offended by a joke, you never stop. In other words, once you say, right, I'm not going to tell jokes about, Jewish people or black people or whatever it may be, once you eliminate one section of community from your target range, he said, actually, you're being very exclusive, right? You're basically saying there's one rule for them and another rule for everybody else. And it made sense to me then. This was back in the early 90s I did this interview.
Did you catch what Dave just laid out there? The market spoke. That's it. That's the entire argument in 3 words. Shane Gillis gets fired from SNL for a joke, right? Canceled, done. The woke mob wins, or so they thought. Then the man sells out stadiums across the country, wall to wall. And suddenly, Saturday Night Live, the same show that threw him out, comes crawling back and hands him the hosting slot. Because money doesn't lie. Audiences don't lie. The people who actually go to comedy shows, buy the tickets, fill the seats, they were never woke. They were never asking for lectures dressed up as punchlines. They wanted to laugh. And the moment the entertainment industry remembered that its business model depends on actual human beings showing up, the woke era was finished. And here's the thing that nobody in legacy media wants to acknowledge. It was never popular. Not once. The woke comedy era never had a real audience. It had a Twitter mob and a boardroom full of people terrified of that mob. That's it. The second the fear broke, the content changed. Dave Smith said it perfectly. By its very fundamental nature, wokeism cannot be funny. It is impossible. And he's right. You cannot build comedy out of telling people what they're not allowed to say. Comedy lives in the place where no one's policing the room, which brings us to Netflix and a roast and a joke about a murdered conservative that ripped the mask off the whole double standard. Watch this.
A joke that Pete Davidson told, and it was this. Let's watch.
Tony reminds me of Charlie Kirk in that he's definitely been on camera letting a guy unload in his throat.
So there will be a lot of people who will have found that crossed a line, that it was too offensive, that it's too soon after Charlie's murder. And you've got to think of his wife, his widow, his family, his kids, people around him who would have probably found that horrendous. When you heard that joke from Peter, which got a mixed response, but when you heard that, did you feel that crossed a line?
Well, listen, Piers, I did stand-up comedy in my 20s, and I decided to end up focus on making money, and that's how I met PBD in the finance world, and we started the podcast together in 2020. But I know funny. What happened with me personally, and I'll get to Charlie Kirk, because I knew Charlie Kirk very well, is I said, rather than being a stand-up comedian and sleeping on friends' couches, let me make some money. 10 years later, I made a bunch of money. I owned a stand-up comedy club, and I hired comedians. In fact, the biggest star on SNL, I found him when he was 19, Marcelo Hernandez, who has the #1 show on Netflix right now. He actually worked for myself and PBD at Valuetainment. So I know funny. I'm sitting in a van down by the river right now, sweating my tush off right here. I'll shout out to Chris Farley. I've been around funny people. In fact, you know Vinny Oshana, who's on your show, one of the funniest, greatest people, who's about to cross 1 million in comedy. He's incredible. But there's also people who make their name in this career by not being that funny. Pete Davidson is one of them. Jimmy Kimmel is one of them. I'm not gonna go there and say Dave Smith is one of them. That's not what I'm gonna do. But the reality is Charlie Kirk was an absolute hero. And what's happening with him, people are literally taking their proverbial shots at him. The bottom line is this. Pete Davidson, name one famous joke he's ever made. I can tell you jokes that Dave Chappelle made, that George Carlin made, that every single comedian had famously made, Chris Rock, right? Bring me the big piece of chicken. What has Pete Davidson ever done that's been funny? In fact, when your dating career is more in the headlines than your comedy career, you're probably not that funny. So it's just par for the course. But the bottom line is this. We need to stop being so offended in this country and realize that free societies love comedians. And that's where we are.
Right, but so you end with a little stinger at the end because it looked like you were going down a path of saying you thought Pete Davidson crossed a line. So do you think he crossed a line? And should Netflix have aired that joke?
I don't think there's any line you can cross. The market will speak. If Pete Davidson wants to start doing stand-up comedy shows again and nobody shows up, let the market speak. I believe in free market capitalism. I don't believe in censorship. I don't believe in cancel culture, even if you're unfunny. If we were canceling unfunny people, there's a lot of comedians that would have been canceled years ago, Pete Davidson being one of them. So there's no line to cross.
Okay.
So let's just sit with what we all just watched. Pete Davidson tells a joke about Charlie Kirk, a man who was shot and killed, a conservative hero, and the room laughs. The panel debates whether it crossed the line. Dave Smith calls it hilarious. Fine, that's his right. Adam makes the point that free societies protect comedians and the market decides. Also fine. That's the correct answer on free speech. But here's what nobody in that room said loudly enough. Emily got closest to it. Would Netflix have aired that joke if it was about a beloved Democrat who was assassinated? You already know the answer. You know it in your gut, and so does everyone watching right now. They would not have aired it. Not in a million years. The same Netflix that had employees staging walkouts over Dave Chappelle. The same Netflix that for years bent to every pressure campaign the woke left could manufacture. That Netflix decided the one joke about a political assassination they were comfortable putting on their platform was the one targeting a conservative, and then had the nerve to act like they discovered free speech. That's not courage. That's selective bravado. It's easy to be edgy in one direction. It takes nothing. The real test of whether the woke era is actually dead is not whether Netflix airs one shocking roast. The real test is whether they apply the same standard to everyone, left and right, Democrat and Republican, living and dead. And based on everything we just watched, that test is still failing. Dave Smith is right that comedy should be free. Adam is right that the market should decide. But the market only works when the playing field is level. And right now, it is not level. The conservatives in this country who have watched their voices get muted, their comedians get canceled, their political figures turned into punchlines, while the other side gets a permanent protected class status, they see it. They've always seen it. And the fact that we're sitting here in 2025 debating whether a joke about a murdered conservative crossed the line, while the people who spent years shutting down anyone who dared laugh at the wrong target are suddenly champions of free expression, that tells you everything. Woke didn't just kill comedy, it rigged the room. And some of us never forgot that.